Welcome back to the Reckoning Files. What I'm about to share with you isn't just another tale of plantation brutality. This is the story of a woman who turned the dinner table into a graveyard, who transformed her master's greatest celebration into his final hours on earth. For 12 years, Patience Whitmore endured unspeakable horrors in the big house at Bellmont Estate. She smiled while serving meals to the family that destroyed hers. She curtsied while her soul screamed for justice. But on September 14, 1852, during the most lavish Cotton Harvest Celebration Natchez, Mississippi had ever seen, Patience served more than roasted duck and sweet potatoes. She served death itself, carefully portioned onto fine china plates, seasoned with years of accumulated rage and knowledge that had been passed down through whispered conversations in the kitchen house. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This investigation will take us deep into the swamps of Mississippi, through the hidden spaces where enslaved people preserved ancient knowledge of roots and herbs that could heal or kill. We'll uncover how a 12-year-old girl's traumatic encounter in the master's study awakened something dark and patient within her. How she spent 4 years learning the secrets of oleander and nightshade from an elderly cook who had her own reasons for revenge, and how 23 of the South's wealthiest plantation owners died writhing in agony while fiddle music still played in the pavilion. The authorities called it food poisoning. The enslaved community knew better. They had witnessed Patience's transformation from broken child to avenging angel, and they had helped her disappear into the network of safe houses that stretched all the way to Philadelphia. What happened at Bellmont Estate that September night has been deliberately erased from official records. The families involved paid enormous sums to suppress the truth, to bury the scandal that would have revealed just how vulnerable the entire system of slavery really was. But I spent months tracing court documents, reading between the lines of newspaper accounts that blamed tainted oysters, and tracking down descendants who still whisper about the night their ancestors clutched their throats and begged for water that would never come. This isn't a story about a helpless victim. This is a story about calculated vengeance, about a young woman who understood that the only way to escape her cage was to unlock it with the keys of her oppressor's mortality. The summer heat in Natchez was oppressive in 1848, the kind of wet thickness that made breathing feel like drowning. 12-year-old Patience moved through the big house at Bellmont Estate with the practiced invisibility that all house slaves learned early. She had been born in the small cabin behind the kitchen house, delivered by her mother Ruth, with only the elderly cook Grace present to cut the cord and wrap her in clean rags. From her first breath, Patience belonged to Harrison Bellmont, just as her mother belonged to him, just as every child born on the plantation was added to his ledger as property with an estimated value. Patience's earliest memories were of the kitchen house, that separate building where enslaved women transformed raw ingredients into the elaborate meals that maintained the Bellmont family's reputation for refined hospitality. Grace had taken an interest in the quiet child who watched everything with dark, observant eyes. While other children played in the dusty yards between the slave quarters, Patience would sit in the corner of the kitchen watching Grace's weathered hands move through the rituals of cooking. The old woman would occasionally glance at the girl and smile, recognizing something in her steady gaze that suggested she was cataloging information, storing it away for some future purpose neither of them could yet name. The kitchen house was Patience's sanctuary during those early years. Grace ruled that space with an authority that even Catherine Bellmont respected, though that respect was always wrapped in the contempt that defined every interaction between enslaved and enslaver. Grace had been cooking for the Bellmont family for 40 years, ever since she was purchased as a young woman of 28. She had watched Harrison Bellmont grow from a spoiled boy into a cruel man, had watched his father die choking on his own blood after what everyone said was a sudden fit of apoplexy. Grace never spoke directly about that death, but sometimes, when she worked with certain nerves, she would hum old songs in a language that predated her enslavement, and her eyes would grow distant with memory. By the time Patience turned 10, she had begun assisting Grace in earnest. Her small hands were perfect for the delicate work of decorating cakes and arranging garnishes. She learned to pluck chickens with efficiency, to scale fish without damaging the flesh, to recognize the exact moment when cream had been whipped to the proper consistency. But she also learned other things during those hours in the kitchen house. She learned which mushrooms grew near the swamp could make a person violently ill, which berries caused disorientation and fever, which roots could stop a heart if prepared correctly. Grace taught these lessons casually, almost as afterthoughts while discussing proper cooking techniques. She would point to a particular plant growing near the kitchen door and mention that despite its pretty flowers, just a few leaves could cause terrible stomach cramps. She would note that the seeds of certain common garden plants contain compounds that could induce seizures if ground fine enough and consumed in sufficient quantity. Patients absorbed this information without fully understanding why Grace was sharing it. She was a child, focused on pleasing the old woman who treated her with kindness, on earning praise for her improving kitchen skills. She didn't yet know that Grace was doing what enslaved people had done for generations, passing down knowledge that could be used for survival, for resistance, for revenge. The old woman had decided that Patience was worthy of these secrets, that something in the girl's character suggested she might one day need them. Grace had lived long enough to recognize certain qualities in young people, a combination of intelligence and anger and patience that, if properly cultivated, could become a powerful weapon against those who believed themselves untouchable. Patience's father, Isaac, was a field hand, one of nearly 80 enslaved men and women who worked the cotton that made the Bellmont family wealthy. She saw him rarely during these years. Field slaves and house slaves inhabited different worlds on the plantation, and Harrison Bellmont deliberately kept families separated to prevent ties of affection from challenging the absolute authority of the master.
The formation of strong bonds that might lead to coordinated resistance. Isaac was a tall man with powerful shoulders and hands that were always cut and scarred from the cotton plants. When Patience did see him, usually on Sunday afternoons when slaves were given a few hours of rest, he would lift her up and hold her close, and she would feel the deep exhaustion in his body, the way he moved like someone much older than his 40 years. Ruth, Patience's mother, worked as a laundress, spending her days in clouds of steam and lye soap, washing the endless linens and clothing that plantation life generated. Her hands were perpetually raw and cracked, her back bent from years of lifting heavy wet fabric. But Ruth maintained a fierce dignity that even the hardest labor couldn't diminish. She had taught Patience to speak properly, to carry herself with grace, to never let the Bellmonts see the rage that burned inside her. Ruth had watched 3 of her children sold away before Patience was born, babies torn from her arms and carried off to distant plantations where she would never see them again. That loss had carved something permanent out of her soul, but it had also taught her survival strategies that she passed to her youngest child. Never look them directly in the eye for too long. Never speak unless spoken to. Never show fear, but never show defiance either. Find the invisible middle ground where you can exist without drawing attention, without becoming a target. These lessons served Patience well during her early years in the big house. She learned to anticipate Catherine Bellmont's needs before they were spoken, to move through rooms without disturbing conversations, to be present but unnoticed. Catherine was a thin woman with pale skin that flushed easily in anger and eyes that constantly searched for faults to punish. She supervised the house slaves with meticulous cruelty, inspecting every corner for dust, every surface for imperfection. A poorly ironed collar could result in a beating. A slightly overcooked roast could mean a day without food. Catherine seemed to take genuine pleasure in these small tyrannies, in the power she exercised over women who had no choice but to submit to her demands. But it was Harrison Bellmont who truly terrified Patience, even before the incident that would change everything. The master of Bellmont.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Estate was a man who cultivated an image of refined Southern gentility. He wore expensive suits and quoted poetry at dinner parties. He attended church every Sunday and contributed generously to charitable causes in Natchez. But the enslaved people who lived under his authority knew the truth. They knew about the special room in the cellar where disobedient slaves were taken. They knew about the young women who were summoned to his study late at night and returned with dead eyes and torn clothing. They knew about the casual violence that erupted whenever Harrison felt his authority questioned, the way he could transition from jovial host to savage punisher in the span of a heartbeat. Patience's understanding of Harrison Bellmont's true nature was theoretical until the summer afternoon in 1848, when everything changed. She had been sent to his study to bring fresh water and clean the fireplace. It was a routine task, one she had performed dozens of times. But on this particular day, Harrison was in the study with Thomas, his 22-year-old son, and they were drinking whiskey despite the early hour. Patience entered quietly, announced her presence with a soft clearing of her throat, and began her work, trying to be as invisible as possible. She could hear the men talking behind her, their voices slightly slurred, discussing business matters and upcoming social obligations. What happened next occurred with such sudden brutality that Patience barely had time to understand it was happening. Thomas made some comment about Patience's developing body, a crude observation that made Harrison laugh. Then Thomas was standing behind her, his hands grabbing her roughly, pulling her away from the fireplace. She tried to twist away, to run for the door, but Harrison blocked her path. The water pitcher fell from her hands and shattered on the wooden floor. She opened her mouth to scream, but Harrison's palm clamped over her face, cutting off her air. Thomas forced her down onto the desk, scattering papers and ledgers. She fought with everything she had, scratching and kicking, but she was 12 years old and small for her age, and they were grown men who saw her not as a human being, but as property they could use however they wished. The assault lasted an eternity and no time at all. When it was finally over, Patience lay crumpled on the floor among the broken pieces of the water pitcher, her dress torn, her body screaming with pain. Harrison adjusted his clothing and lit a cigar as if nothing significant had occurred. Thomas straightened his collar and poured himself another glass of whiskey. Then Harrison looked down at Patience with eyes that held no remorse, no acknowledgement of having done anything wrong. He spoke to her in the same tone he might use to instruct her about polishing silver. She would clean up this mess immediately. She would never speak of what happened to anyone. If she told her mother or anyone else, he would sell Ruth south to the sugar plantations in Louisiana, where life expectancy was measured in months. He would have Isaac whipped until his back was nothing but torn meat. Did she understand? Patience, unable to speak, managed a small nod. Harrison smiled then, a cold expression that never reached his eyes, and told her to get out of his sight. Patience gathered the broken pottery with shaking hands, blood dripping from cuts on her palms, and somehow made it out of the study and through the big house. She couldn't go to the slave quarters where her mother would immediately know something terrible had happened. She couldn't go to the kitchen house where Grace would ask questions. Instead, she stumbled toward the swamp that bordered the plantation's eastern edge, pushing through the dense vegetation until she was hidden from view. There, finally alone, she vomited until there was nothing left in her stomach, then curled into a ball among the cypress roots and Spanish moss and sobbed with a despair so profound it felt like dying. She stayed in the swamp until darkness fell, her mind fractured by what had been done to her. Part of her wanted to wade into the deep water and let it close over her head, to escape into the peace of death. But another part of her, some core of survival that refused to be extinguished, kept her breathing, kept her conscious. As night creatures began their chorus around her, as the air filled with the sounds of frogs and insects, Patience felt something shifting inside her chest, as if her heart had been replaced with something harder, something colder. The grief and shame that threatened to drown her began to instead coalesce into one pure, unadulterated emotion: rage. And rage could be a powerful weapon, transforming into something else entirely. Rage. Pure, focused rage that burned away everything soft and vulnerable and replaced it with steel. When Patience finally emerged from the swamp, covered in mud and insect bites, she found Grace waiting near the kitchen house with a lantern. The old woman took one look at the girl's face and understood immediately. She didn't ask questions. She simply guided Patience inside, heated water for a bath, and cleaned her wounds with gentle efficiency. While she worked, Grace hummed those old songs again. Songs from across the ocean, from a time before chains and ships and auction blocks. When Patience was finally clean and wearing fresh clothes, Grace sat beside her and spoke in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. She told Patience that she was not the first girl this had happened to, and sadly, she would not be the last. She told her that what the Bellmonts had done was evil, but that evil men often prospered in this world, at least for a time. Then Grace looked directly into Patience's eyes and asked a question that would define the next 4 years of the girl's life. Did Patience want to learn how to make sure evil men's time eventually ran out? Grace's question hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Patience looked at the old woman's face, at the deep lines carved by decades of suffering and survival, and saw something she had never noticed before. Grace's eyes held secrets that went far beyond recipes for cornbread and roasted chicken. They held knowledge that had been passed down through generations, knowledge that had crossed the ocean in the minds of people stolen from their homelands, knowledge that had been whispered in dark corners and preserved despite every attempt to erase it. Patience nodded slowly, unable to speak around the tightness in her throat. Grace stood and moved to a cabinet in the corner of the kitchen house, one that Patience had seen opened countless times before. But now, Grace reached behind the jars of flour and sugar to a hidden space at the very back. She withdrew a small leather pouch, worn soft with age and use. When she opened it, Patience could see dried leaves and roots, some ground to powder, others still intact. Grace set the pouch on the table between them and began what would become 4 years of careful instruction in the art of botanical warfare. The lessons began innocently enough. Grace would point out plants growing near the kitchen house or along the paths through the plantation grounds. She would mention their properties in passing, as if sharing idle observations. That cluster of white flowers by the fence was oleander, beautiful to look at, but containing enough poison in a single leaf to stop a human heart within hours. The symptoms would look like natural heart failure, nothing suspicious, nothing that would raise questions. The foxglove growing in Catherine Bellmont's own garden could slow or accelerate a heartbeat depending on dosage, and in sufficient quantity would cause death that mimicked apoplexy. The castor beans that grew wild near the swamp contained ricin, one of the deadliest substances known, and just a few seeds properly prepared could kill a grown man while leaving almost no trace. Grace taught Patience how to identify these plants in all seasons, how to harvest them at the optimal time for maximum potency, how to dry and store them properly. But she also taught something more important: patience itself, the quality for which the girl had been named. Poison was not a weapon of impulse, Grace explained. It required planning, careful preparation, and above all, the ability to wait for the perfect moment. A poisoner who acted rashly would be caught and executed. A poisoner who learned to wait, to plan, to create opportunities that appeared natural, could operate undetected for years. During the daylight hours, Patience continued her normal duties in the big house. She served meals to the Bellmont family, cleaned their rooms, and maintained the facade of the obedient slave who knew her place. She was careful never to look at Harrison or Thomas for too long, never to show any emotion beyond mild deference. When Harrison summoned her to his study again 3 months after the first assault, she went without resistance. When it happened again, and again after that, she endured it with a blank face and empty eyes, retreating into a mental space where she cataloged every detail of his habits, his preferences, his routines. She was gathering intelligence, though she didn't yet know exactly how she would use it. The psychological toll of these repeated violations would have destroyed someone without Grace's guidance. But the old woman had created a framework that transformed Patience's suffering into fuel for her education. After each assault, Patience would make her way to the kitchen house, and Grace would be waiting. The old woman never spoke directly about what had happened, but she would assign Patience a new lesson, a new plant to study, a new preparation method to master. The work gave Patience something to focus on beyond her trauma, a sense of purpose that kept the darkness from consuming her entirely. Grace also taught Patience about dosage and timing, the subtle mathematics of death that separated a successful poisoning from a failed attempt. Too much poison administered too quickly would cause obvious symptoms that might prompt medical examination. Too little would merely sicken the victim without achieving the desired result. The art lay in finding the perfect amount, delivered gradually enough to mimic natural illness, but concentrated enough to be lethal. Grace had Patience practice with mice and rats that infested the plantation's outbuildings, teaching her to calculate dosages based on body weight and to observe the progression of symptoms. It was grim work, watching small creatures convulse and die, but Patience approached it with clinical detachment. These were not pets. They were training tools, and every dead mouse represented knowledge that might someday free her from her tormentors.
Torture and murder enslaved people with impunity. She had seen children sold away from their mothers, had seen men worked to death in the cotton fields, had seen women raped and discarded. Grace herself had borne 3 children to Harrison's father, children who had been sold when they were old enough to work, taken away one by one until she was left alone with only her memories and her rage. She had learned her poisoner's craft from her own grandmother, who had learned it in Africa before being captured and transported across the ocean in chains. That knowledge had been passed down as a form of resistance, a way to fight back against those who believed they were untouchable. Grace had never used her knowledge to kill, though she had been tempted many times. Fear had held her back, fear of being caught, fear of the reprisals that would fall not just on her, but on everyone she cared about. But she saw in Patience something she had never possessed herself, a core of cold determination that might actually follow through where Grace had always hesitated. The old woman was also dying, though she hadn't told Patience yet. There was a growth in her stomach that had been slowly expanding for the past year, causing her increasing pain that she hid during her daily work. Grace knew she had perhaps 2 years left, 3 at most. She wanted to see justice done before she died, and Patience was going to be her instrument. The relationship between Grace and Patience deepened during these years into something that transcended the typical bond between elder and apprentice. Grace became the mother that Ruth could not be, the one person who truly understood the transformation occurring within Patience's soul. The old woman recognized that she was creating something dangerous, a young woman who would be capable of killing without hesitation. But Grace believed that such danger was necessary. The institution of slavery could only be resisted through the tools available to the enslaved, and if those tools included poison and death, then so be it. Grace had made her peace with the moral implications of her teachings. She was arming Patience for a war that had been raging for generations, a war fought in shadows and silence, but no less real for its invisibility. Patience's relationship with her mother Ruth became strained during this period. Ruth could see that her daughter was changing, hardening in ways that frightened her. The bright, curious child who had once sought comfort in her mother's arms had been replaced by someone colder, more distant. Ruth didn't know the specifics of what was happening to Patience in the big house, though she suspected the truth. She also noticed the girl's frequent absences to the kitchen house, the long conversations with Grace that would fall silent whenever Ruth approached. She wanted to intervene, to pull Patience away from whatever path she was walking, but she also understood that in the world of slavery, there were some lessons that could only be learned through suffering, and some transformations that could not be prevented. Isaac, Patience's father, knew even less about his daughter's evolution. He still saw her only occasionally on those rare Sundays when field slaves and house slaves were allowed brief interactions. Each time he saw her, she seemed like a stranger. The shy child who had once climbed onto his lap and fallen asleep against his chest had become a self-contained young woman who answered his questions with polite distance. Isaac attributed this change to the natural process of growing up, to the way plantation life forced children to mature too quickly. He didn't know about the assaults, didn't know about Grace's lessons, didn't know that his daughter was being systematically trained to become something unprecedented in the small world of Bellmont Estate. The plantation itself continued its rhythms unchanged during these years. Spring brought planting season, with enslaved men and women spending 18-hour days in the field, their hands bleeding from the sharp cotton plants, their backs aching from constant stooping. Summer brought the oppressive heat that made the work even more brutal, when the sun beat down without mercy and slaves collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration. Fall brought harvest time, when every available person was pressed into picking cotton before the weather turned, when the pressure to meet quotas led to increased violence from the overseers. Winter brought a brief respite, though it was filled with maintenance work in preparation for the next planting cycle. Harrison Bellmont's wealth continued during this period. Cotton prices remained high, and his reputation as a successful planter brought him social and political influence throughout Mississippi. He entertained other plantation owners at elaborate dinners, served meals prepared by Grace and increasingly by Patience, who had become Grace's primary assistant. These dinners were performances of refinement and culture, with multiple courses and fine wines, with conversation about literature and politics and the supposed burden of managing inferior races. The enslaved people who served these meals, who stood silent and invisible while their oppressors discussed whether Negroes had souls, developed their own techniques for maintaining sanity. Some retreated into religious faith, believing that justice would come in the next world if not in this one. Others found solace in the small communities they built in the slave quarters, in music and storytelling, and in the preservation of traditions that connected them to their heritage. And a very few, like Patience, found purpose in planning revenge. When Patience turned 14, Grace began teaching her about compound poisons, combinations of multiple toxic substances that were harder to detect and produced more varied symptoms. She explained how to use one poison to mask the effects of another, how to create symptom profiles that would confuse any doctor who examined the victim. Grace also taught Patience about human psychology, about how to read people's habits and exploit their weaknesses. Harrison Bellmont, for instance, was a creature of rigid routine. He took his coffee at precisely 6 o'clock in the morning, always in his study, always alone. He drank port wine after dinner every evening, always the same vintage, always poured by Patience or one of the other house slaves. These dinners were performances of refinement and culture, with multiple courses and fine wines, with conversation about literature and politics, and the supposed burden of managing inferior races. The enslaved people who served these meals, who stood silent and invisible while their oppressors discussed whether Negroes had souls, developed their own techniques for maintaining sanity. Some retreated into religious faith, believing that justice would come in the next world, if not in this one. Others found solace in the small communities they built in the slave quarters, in music and storytelling, and in the preservation of traditions that connected them to their heritage. And a very few, like Patience, found purpose in planning revenge.
Enough to wait for the perfect moment. Grace drilled into Patience the importance of never deviating from established patterns, never doing anything that might draw attention or suspicion. The best poisoners, she explained, were those who remained utterly invisible, who performed their duties so perfectly that no one would ever think to blame them when death came. Catherine Bellmont, Harrison's wife, presented different challenges. She was paranoid and observant, constantly watching the house slaves for any sign of defiance or incompetence. She had her own routines, but they were less predictable than her husband's. She often changed her mind about meals or schedules, keeping the household staff in a state of constant anxiety. Grace taught patients that Catherine was not a suitable target, at least not initially. Her unpredictability made her too dangerous to approach, and her death would trigger intensive investigations that might expose other plans. Better to focus on Harrison and Thomas, whose habits were well established and whose deaths could be made to appear natural. Thomas Bellmont had grown into a younger version of his father, equally cruel but less sophisticated in his brutality. He drank heavily and often visited the slave quarters at night, selecting young women for his entertainment and returning them used and broken. He had recently become engaged to the daughter of another wealthy planter, a union designed to merge two cotton empires and increase both families' influence. The wedding was planned for the fall of 1852, timed to coincide with the annual Cotton Harvest Celebration that the Bellmont family hosted every September. This celebration had become a major social event in the region, attracting plantation owners from across Mississippi and neighboring states. It was an opportunity for the Southern elite to display their wealth and reinforce their bonds, to celebrate another successful harvest and their continued prosperity, built on the backs of enslaved labor. Grace saw the upcoming celebration as the perfect opportunity for what she had been training patients to do. With dozens of guests and an elaborate feast requiring days of preparation, the chaos would provide cover for actions that might be noticed in normal circumstances. Grace had been planning this for years, even before she began teaching patients. And now, all the pieces were finally aligning. She was ready to share her full plan with her apprentice, ready to see if 4 years of training had created someone capable of the most audacious act of resistance Bellmont Estate had ever witnessed. On a humid evening in the summer of 1852, Grace finally revealed everything to patients. They were alone in the kitchen house, ostensibly preparing ingredients for the next day's meals. Grace bolted the door and drew the curtains, then turned to face the 16-year-old girl who would become her greatest creation. She told patients that her time was running out, that the growth in her stomach had spread throughout her body, and that she probably wouldn't live to see another spring. She told patients about her own 3 children, sold away decades ago, about the lifetime of suffering and rage that had led to this moment. Then, Grace outlined her plan in detail, a scheme so bold and terrible that even patients, who had spent 4 years preparing for something like this, felt her breath catching her throat. The Cotton Harvest Celebration would be held on September 14th. More than 50 guests were expected, including Harrison's business partners, political allies, and friends. Thomas would be there with his fiancée and her family. Catherine would be orchestrating the entire event, ensuring that Bellmont Estate's reputation for hospitality was maintained. The celebration would begin in the afternoon with drinks and socializing, followed by an elaborate dinner in the evening, and then dancing and entertainment that would continue late into the night. Grace and patients would be responsible for preparing most of the food, assisted by other enslaved women, but ultimately in control of what was served and how it was prepared. Grace's plan called for the selective poisoning of specific guests, primarily Harrison, Thomas, and approximately 20 of their closest associates, men who owned the largest plantations and wielded the most influence in the region. The poison would be introduced through multiple dishes, distributed across the meal so that not everyone ate lethal doses from any single source. The symptoms would begin during the dinner itself, starting with mild discomfort that could be attributed to overeating or too much alcohol. As the evening progressed, the symptoms would intensify, but the festive atmosphere and general chaos would prevent anyone from recognizing what was really happening until it was too late. By the time doctors were summoned, most of the victims would already be beyond help, and the remaining victims would die over the following days, their deaths attributed to the same food poisoning that had killed the others. The beauty of the plan, Grace explained, was that the sheer number of victims would actually provide cover. With so many people falling ill simultaneously, authorities would assume contaminated food rather than deliberate poisoning. They would blame improperly stored meat or tainted shellfish, something accidental rather than intentional. And even if they did suspect foul play, they would have dozens of suspects to consider, hundreds of enslaved people who had helped prepare and serve the meal. The investigation would become hopelessly tangled, especially since many of the guests were already ill-disposed towards thorough examinations that might reveal their own vulnerabilities. Patients listened to Grace's plan with growing understanding of its brilliance and its risks. If they succeeded, they would strike a devastating blow against the plantation system in their region, eliminating some of its most powerful defenders. But if they failed, if they were caught, the consequences would extend far beyond their own deaths. Harrison would almost certainly order mass executions, killing dozens of enslaved people as collective punishment. He might burn the slave quarters, sell everyone who survived, destroy families that had somehow managed to stay together despite the constant threat of separation. The weight of those potential consequences pressed down on patients like a physical force. Grace seemed to read her thoughts. She told patients that this decision had to be hers alone. Grace had taught her everything she knew, had given her the tools and knowledge to carry out this plan, but she would not force or manipulate patients into acting. If patients decided it was too dangerous, too likely to fail, Grace would understand. They would continue their lives as they had been. Grace would die of her illness within the year, and patients would carry this knowledge forward, perhaps using it someday under different circumstances.
But if patients chose to proceed, Grace would support her completely, would help with every aspect of the preparation, would stand beside her, even if it meant they both ended up swinging from the hanging tree near the plantation entrance. Patience closed her eyes and thought about everything that had brought her to this moment.
She thought about Grace's 3 lost children, about the countless other families that had been destroyed by the system that enriched men like Harrison Bellmont. And she thought about the future, about how many more years this would continue, how many more generations would be born into slavery and die without ever knowing freedom. When Patience opened her eyes, Grace saw the answer there before the girl spoke. It was the same cold determination that had been building for 4 years, crystallized now into absolute resolve. Patience told Grace that she would do it, that they would do it together.
Whatever consequences followed, whatever suffering came after, it would be worth it to strike this blow, to show that the enslaved were not powerless, that there were limits to what human beings would endure before they fought back in whatever ways they could. Grace smiled then, a fierce expression of pride and satisfaction, and embraced Patience as a mother would embrace a daughter. They stood together in the kitchen house as darkness fell outside, 2 women separated by generations but united in purpose, ready to transform a celebration of cotton and cruelty into something else entirely, a reckoning that would be whispered about for generations. The preparations for the Cotton Harvest Celebration began in earnest 3 weeks before the event. Catherine Bellmont threw herself into the planning with manic energy, determined that this year's celebration would surpass all previous ones. She drew up elaborate menus, requisitioned supplies from Natchez merchants, and drove the household staff mercilessly to ensure every detail would be perfect. Grace and Patience worked 16-hour days, testing recipes and preparing ingredients that could be made in advance. To all outward appearances, they were simply performing their assigned duties with their usual efficiency. No one watching them would have suspected that they were simultaneously preparing for mass murder. Grace had already harvested and prepared the necessary poisons over the preceding months, storing them in the hidden compartment of her cabinet where they would remain undetected. She had chosen a combination of oleander, foxglove, and castor bean derivatives, each prepared in slightly different forms to create a symptom profile that would be confusing and seemingly natural. The oleander would cause the initial gastrointestinal distress and cardiac irregularities. The foxglove would intensify the cardiac symptoms and cause the neurological effects that would mimic stroke or apoplexy. The ricin from the castor beans would ensure that even victims who survived the initial symptoms would succumb over the following days, their organs systematically failing in ways that would be attributed to the original poisoning event. The two women discussed every aspect of the plan in whispers during rare moments of privacy. They identified which dishes would be used as delivery vehicles for which poisons. The roasted duck would be glazed with a sauce containing oleander, masked by strong herbs and citrus. The candied yams would be prepared with castor bean oil that had been processed to concentrate the ricin. The special port wine, reserved for Harrison and his inner circle, would be laced with foxglove extract, its bitter taste hidden by the wine's natural complexity. Not every dish would be poisoned, and the poisons would be distributed to ensure that guests who avoided certain foods might still consume lethal doses from other sources. They also planned their escape route, though this part of the plan was necessarily vague. After the dinner, during the chaos that would follow as guests began falling violently ill, patients would slip away from the plantation. Grace, too old and too sick to run, would remain behind. She would claim ignorance, would play the role of the faithful servant shocked by the tragedy. She would almost certainly be interrogated and possibly executed, but she had made her peace with that outcome. Her goal was to ensure that patients escaped, that at least one of them survived to carry forward the knowledge of what they had done and why. Grace had connections through the network of enslaved people who traded information across plantations. She had sent word through this network to contacts in Natchez who could help patients disappear, who could connect her with the underground railroad routes that ran north to freedom. The days leading up to September 14th moved with agonizing slowness for patients, each hour stretching into what felt like days as the weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her consciousness. She moved through her duties in the big house with mechanical precision, her hands performing familiar tasks while her mind rehearsed every detail of the plan. She served breakfast to the Bellmont family, observing Harrison as he read his newspaper and sipped his coffee, cataloging his movements and habits one final time. She cleaned Catherine's bedroom while the mistress supervised with her usual critical eye, noting the locations of valuables that might be useful during her escape. She endured another summons to Harrison's study 3 days before the celebration, lying beneath him while her mind floated somewhere above her body, detached and calculating, thinking about how soon he would be writhing in a very different kind of agony. Grace had begun the physical preparations for the feast with characteristic thoroughness. The kitchen house became a hive of controlled activity as ingredients arrived from merchants in Natchez and from the plantation's own stores. Sides of beef hung in the smokehouse. Ducks and chickens were slaughtered and plucked. Vegetables were harvested from the kitchen garden. Catherine inspected everything multiple times, her thin fingers poking at meat to test its freshness, her nose wrinkling at imagined imperfections. Grace tolerated these inspections with the patient deference she had perfected over 4 decades. Assuring Mrs. Bellmont that everything would be exactly as she desired, that the celebration would be a triumph that people would talk about for years. Come. This last statement was truer than Catherine could possibly imagine. Other enslaved women were brought in to assist with the massive cooking effort. Ruth was pulled from her laundry duties to help with vegetable preparation. 2 younger women from the slave quarters, named Flora and Dinah, were assigned to assist with the endless tasks of peeling, chopping, and stirring. Grace and Patience worked alongside them, but maintained careful control over which dishes they prepared themselves and which could be delegated. The poisoned items would be handled exclusively by the 2 conspirators, prepared in moments when the kitchen house was less crowded, when they could work without observation. Patience found herself studying the other women during these preparation days, wondering what they would think if they knew what was being planned. Ruth worked with her characteristic quiet efficiency, her scarred hands moving through piles of potatoes and carrots, occasionally glancing at her daughter with an expression that mixed love and concern. Flora, barely 18 years old, sang softly while she worked. hymns about Jordan River and promised lands, her voice carrying a hope that patients had long since abandoned. Dinah, older and more worn down by life, rarely spoke at all, her face set in lines of permanent resignation. These women had survived by accepting their condition, by finding small moments of joy or connection within the prison of their enslavement. What Patience was about to do would shatter whatever fragile stability they had managed to create. This thought troubled Patience more than she expected. Grace had warned her that innocent people would suffer consequences from their actions, that Harrison would almost certainly order brutal reprisals against the remaining enslaved population. But understanding this intellectually was different from confronting it emotionally. Patience watched Ruth laughing at something Flora said, a brief moment of genuine happiness breaking through her usual guardedness, and felt a sharp pain in her chest. Her mother would be among those who faced Harrison's wrath after the poisoning was discovered. Ruth might be whipped, sold, or simply worked to death in retaliation for what her daughter had done. The same fate awaited Isaac, along with dozens of others who had no knowledge of the plot and no ability to protect themselves from its fallout. During a rare moment alone with Grace, Patience voiced these doubts. The old woman listened without interruption, then responded with a frankness that bordered on cruelty. She told Patience that there was no such thing as a clean revolution, no way to overthrow power without collateral damage. The enslaved population at Bellmont Estate was already suffering, already dying slowly under the weight of their bondage. Some of them would die more quickly after the celebration, yes, but others might eventually benefit if the deaths of so many wealthy planters weakened the institution of slavery itself. Grace acknowledged that this was cold comfort, that the people who would pay the immediate price were not the ones who deserved to suffer, but she insisted that moral paralysis in the face of evil was itself a form of evil, that sometimes the only way to fight monsters was to become monstrous yourself. Patience absorbed these words and recognized their truth, even as part of her recoiled from their implications. She understood that Grace was offering her one final opportunity to back out, to abandon the plan and return to the relative safety of passive suffering. But Patience also understood that she had already crossed a threshold that made retreat impossible. She had spent 4 years transforming herself into a weapon, had endured countless violations while nurturing her rage and sharpening her knowledge. To turn back now would mean accepting that all of that suffering had been meaningless, that she would remain a victim for the rest of her life. The thought was unbearable. Whatever consequences followed, whatever innocent blood was spilled because of her actions, she would carry that burden. But she would carry it as someone who had fought back, who had refused to accept her own powerlessness. 2 days before the celebration, a wagon arrived from Natchez carrying the final supplies Catherine had ordered. Among the crates of wine and specialty ingredients was a package addressed to Grace, sent by a merchant she had dealt with for years. Catherine barely glanced at it, assuming it contained some cooking implement or spice the old woman had requested. In fact, the package contained items that had been carefully arranged through Grace's underground network, documents and clothing that Patience would need for her escape. There was a letter of transit forged to indicate that the bearer was a free woman named Ruth Parker, traveling to visit family in Tennessee. There was a simple dress of the type a free black woman might wear, along with a bonnet and shawl. There was also a small amount of money, not much, but enough to pay for food and shelter during the journey north. Grace hid these items in the same cabinet that held her poisons, in a different hidden compartment that Patience had not known existed. The old woman explained that she had been planning escape routes for years, had maintained connections with free blacks in Natchez who operated as part of the Underground Railroad network. These contacts had agreed to help Patience disappear after the celebration, to hide her until the initial searches died down, and then move her north through a series of safe houses. The journey would be dangerous and would require Patience to travel alone for significant stretches, but it was possible. Others had made similar escapes, and with proper preparation and luck, Patience could be in free territory within a few weeks. The night before the celebration, Grace and Patience worked late in the kitchen house after the other women had been dismissed. This was their final opportunity to prepare the poisoned dishes without observation. Grace had already extracted the toxic compounds and stored them in small vials that looked like ordinary spice containers.
Now they began the delicate work of incorporating these poisons into specific dishes, in dosages calculated to be lethal but not immediately obvious. The duck glaze was prepared with extraordinary care. The oleander extract mixed with honey, citrus, and herbs in proportions that masked its presence while maintaining its deadly properties. The sauce would be applied to the ducks tomorrow, just before they were served, ensuring maximum freshness and potency. The candied yams required even more careful preparation. Grace had processed castor beans to extract ricin in its most concentrated form, a procedure that had taken weeks and carried significant risk of self-poisoning. This ricin was now mixed with butter, brown sugar, and spices to create a glaze that
would coat the yams. The amount of ricin in each serving would be relatively small, but it would be enough. Ricin worked slowly, its effects not manifesting for hours or even days after consumption, which meant that victims who ate the yams would not connect their illness to this specific dish. They would blame the more immediate symptoms caused by the oleander and foxglove, never suspecting that a slower poison was simultaneously destroying their organs at a cellular level. The port wine for Harrison and his inner circle required the most delicate touch. Grace had prepared a foxglove tincture so concentrated that just a few drops would be sufficient to cause fatal cardiac arrhythmia. The challenge was introducing this tincture into the wine bottles without disturbing the sediment or changing the wine's appearance. Grace had practiced this procedure with water and harmless dyes, perfecting the technique of using a thin needle to inject liquid through the cork without leaving visible damage. Tonight, she would perform this procedure for real, treating 6 bottles of Harrison's finest port with enough poison to kill everyone who drank from them. Patients watched Grace work, memorizing every movement and technique. The old woman's hands, gnarled with arthritis and scarred from decades of kitchen work, moved with surprising precision and steadiness. Her face was calm, almost serene as she handled substances that could kill her if she made even a small mistake. This was Grace's life's work, culminating in these final preparations, the sum total of her accumulated knowledge and rage being channeled into instruments of death disguised as celebration. When she finished treating the last wine bottle, Grace carefully cleaned all her implements and returned the empty poison vials to their hiding place. She turned to Patience and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of finality. Everything was ready. Tomorrow they would serve a feast that Natchez society would never forget. They spent the remaining hours before dawn reviewing the plan one final time. Patience would arrive at the kitchen house at first light to begin the final cooking preparations. The other women would join them shortly after, and the work of preparing dozens of dishes for 50 guests would consume the entire day. The poisoned items would be prepared during moments when Patience and Grace were alone or when the other women were occupied elsewhere. The timing had to be perfect. The duck would be glazed and roasted in the late afternoon, ensuring it was still warm when served. The yams would be prepared in the morning, but glazed just before serving. The poisoned port would be served only to Harrison and his closest associates, the men who wielded the most power and who would be the primary targets. The dinner itself would begin at 7 in the evening, after guests had spent the afternoon socializing and drinking on the lawn. There would be multiple courses, each carefully timed to create the elaborate dining experience that Catherine had orchestrated. Soup to start, then fish, then the poisoned duck with various side dishes, including the yams. There would be a pause before dessert, allowing guests to digest and socialize between courses. During this pause, the poisoned port would be served to the men while the women were offered sweet wines and cordials. Dessert would follow, elaborate cakes and pies that Grace and Patience had spent days preparing. By the time dessert was finished, probably around 9 or 10 in the evening, the first victims would begin showing symptoms. Grace explained to Patience exactly what to expect. The oleander would cause initial symptoms within 1 to 2 hours of consumption, beginning with nausea, vomiting, and abdominal pain. Guests would likely attribute these symptoms to overeating or bad shellfish, but as more people began experiencing the same symptoms simultaneously, panic would set in. The foxglove would cause the cardiac symptoms, irregular heartbeats, and chest pain,
which combined with the oleander's effects would create a scenario that looked like mass food poisoning. Some victims might die quickly, within hours of the onset of symptoms. Others would linger through the night and into the next day. The ricin would ensure that anyone who survived the initial poisoning would die within a week, their organs systematically failing in ways that doctors of the era would be unable to treat or even fully understand. Patients asked Grace about the timing of her escape. The old woman had thought this through carefully. Once the symptoms began manifesting widely, the celebration would descend into chaos. Guests would be vomiting and collapsing, servants would be running for doctors, Catherine would be screaming orders at everyone. In this confusion, Patience would slip away from the big house and make her way to the kitchen house. She would change into the free woman's clothing hidden in Grace's cabinet, take the forged documents and money, and then leave the plantation on foot. She would avoid the main roads, instead following a path through the swamps that Grace had described in detail. This path would take her to a small dock on the Mississippi River, where a free black boatman named Solomon would be waiting. Solomon had been paid in advance and given specific instructions. He would take Patience downriver to Natchez under the hill, the rough waterfront district where a woman traveling alone would not attract unusual attention. From there, other contacts would help her continue north. Grace made Patience repeat the escape route multiple times, ensuring she had every detail memorized. The old woman also gave her final pieces of advice about survival. Trust no one completely. Keep the forged documents hidden but accessible. If questioned by white authorities, play the role of a simple free Negro woman. Speak respectfully but not obsequiously. Maintain the fiction of visiting family. Avoid other enslaved people who might betray her for reward money. Move quickly but not so quickly as to draw attention. And above all, survive. Survive so that someone would remember what had been done at Bellmont Estate, so that the story of this night would not be completely erased by those who wanted to bury it. As dawn began breaking outside the kitchen house, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink, Grace pulled Patience into an embrace. The old woman's body felt frail, the cancer eating her from the inside, making itself known through her thin frame and the way she winced at certain movements. She told Patience that she was proud of her, that the frightened child who had stumbled into the kitchen house 4 years ago had become someone remarkable and terrible and necessary. Grace said she had no regrets about what they were about to do, that if there was a God who judged such things, she would face that judgment knowing she had finally fought back against a system that had taken everything from her.
Told Patience to be strong, to be smart, to be ruthless when necessary, and to never forget where she came from, were the people who had died so that she might live. Patience held Grace and felt tears streaming down her face for the first time in years. All the grief and rage and fear she had been suppressing came flooding out in that moment. She cried for the child she had been, innocent and hopeful, before Harrison Bellmont destroyed that innocence. She cried for Grace's lost children, for her own father Isaac, who would probably die in retaliation for what she was about to do, for her mother Ruth, who would suffer consequences she didn't deserve. She cried for all the nameless enslaved people who had lived and died without ever striking back, who had endured their suffering in silence because they had no other choice. And she cried for what she was about to become, a mass murderer whose actions would be remembered as either heroic resistance or unforgivable evil, depending on who told the story. When the tears finally stopped, Patience pulled away from Grace and wiped her face. The old woman smiled at her with an expression of fierce pride and love. They had no more time for emotion. The sun was rising, and in a few hours the other women would arrive to begin the day's work. Grace told Patience to go back to the slave quarters, to wash her face and compose herself, to be ready to perform her duties with the same skill and obedience she always demonstrated. Today, of all days, they could not afford to attract any attention or suspicion. Today they had to be perfect in their servitude, invisible in their rage, flawless in their execution of a plan that would end dozens of lives and change countless others. Patience left the kitchen house as the plantation began waking around her. She could hear roosters crowing, slaves emerging from their cabins to begin another day of labor, the distant sounds of the big house coming to life. She walked through this familiar landscape knowing she was seeing it for the last time, that by tomorrow she would either be dead or gone forever. The thought brought a strange sense of peace. Whatever happened tonight, she would no longer be Patience the slave, the property of Harrison Bellmont, the victim who endured assault after assault in silent suffering. She would become something else entirely, someone who had refused to accept her powerlessness, who had learned deadly knowledge and used it to strike back at her tormentors. History might forget her name or remember it with horror, but she would know the truth about who she had been and what she had done. The morning of September 14th arrived with clear skies and moderate temperatures, perfect weather for the celebration Catherine had spent weeks planning. Patience returned to the kitchen house at dawn to find Grace already at work, her movements calm and purposeful as she organized the day's cooking schedule. The other women arrived shortly after, Ruth and Flora and Dinah, all of them carrying the nervous energy that came with preparing for such an important event. Catherine made multiple appearances throughout the morning, inspecting every dish in progress, offering unsolicited advice and criticism, driving everyone to work faster and more carefully. She was in her element, commanding her small army of enslaved women with the confidence of someone who had never questioned her right to do so. The kitchen house became suffocatingly hot as multiple fires and ovens worked simultaneously. Patience moved through the space like a dancer who had memorized every step, her hands performing complex tasks while her mind remained focused on the larger plan. She basted meat, stirred sauces, decorated cakes, all while waiting for the specific moments when she would handle the poisoned dishes. These moments came in brief windows of opportunity throughout the day. While Catherine was inspecting the dining room arrangements, Grace and Patience prepared the duck glaze with its deadly oleander extract. While Ruth and the others were occupied with vegetable preparation, they glazed the candied yams with their ricin coating. Each poisoned dish was marked with tiny, nearly invisible scratches on the serving platters, codes that only Grace and Patience could recognize to ensure they remembered which items were deadly. By mid-afternoon, guests began arriving at Bellmont Estate. Carriages rolled up the long oak-lined drive, disgorging wealthy planters and their families dressed in their finest clothes. The men wore dark suits despite the heat, their faces already flushed from pre-celebration drinking. The women wore elaborate dresses with enormous skirts supported by hoops and crinolines, their hair arranged in complex styles that had taken their own slaves hours to perfect. Children ran across the lawn while their parents socialized, playing games that mimicked the hierarchies their parents maintained through violence and exploitation. The air filled with laughter and conversation, with the sounds of a class celebrating its own prosperity and power, completely unaware that some of them were living their final hours. Harrison Bellmont moved among his guests with the easy confidence of a successful man among his peers. He shook hands, accepted compliments on his beautiful estate, discussed cotton prices and politics with other planters. Thomas stood beside his fiancée, Margaret Ann, a delicate blonde girl who seemed overwhelmed by the size and grandeur of the celebration. Catherine orchestrated everything from the background, ensuring that drinks were refreshed and appetizers circulated, that every guest felt welcomed and impressed. To any observer, it was a perfect representation of Southern hospitality and refinement, a celebration of culture and prosperity that would be remembered fondly by all who attended.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.